1942. Japanese admirals literally laughed when intelligence reported that American welders were building cargo ships in under 2 months, calling them floating coffins that would break apart at sea. By 1945, those same trash Liberty ships had delivered 18 million tons of cargo, while Japan's entire merchant fleet lay at the bottom of the Pacific, and their master craftsmen couldn't replace even a fraction of what America's housewives turned welders built in a single year. How did a nation of inexperienced welders working in shipyards that didn't exist 3 years earlier outbuild an empire with a 300-year naval tradition? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the winter of 1941, inside the grand halls of the Japanese Naval Ministry in Tokyo, admirals in crisp white uniforms gathered around polished wooden tables to discuss their empire's future. The room smelled of tea and tobacco smoke. Maps covered the walls, showing the vast Pacific Ocean and all the islands Japan wanted to control. These men had spent their entire lives studying the art of naval warfare. They believed in one simple truth: quality beats quantity every time. The Japanese way of building warships was an art form passed down through generations. Master craftsmen spent years learning how to shape steel, how to drive rivets with perfect precision, how to create vessels that would last decades. When Japan built the mighty battleship Yamato, it took over 4 years and thousands of skilled workers. Every rivet was placed by hand. Every weld was inspected a dozen times. Every plate of armor was fitted with care that bordered on religious devotion. This was how real ships were made, the admirals believed. This was the warrior's way. Japan's steel mills produce about 7 million tons of steel each year. It wasn't much compared to other nations, but the admirals didn't worry. They would use every ounce wisely. They would build fewer ships, but each one would be a masterpiece. Their Zero fighters could outmaneuver any plane in the sky. Their torpedoes ran faster and hit harder than American ones. Their sailors trained with a dedication that Western nations couldn't match. Why build 100 average ships when you could build 10 perfect ones? Across the Pacific Ocean, the admirals saw a nation they didn't respect. America was rich, yes. America had factories, lots of them. But Americans were soft. They loved comfort and movies and jazz music. They didn't have the warrior spirit. They didn't understand sacrifice. Their workers were just workers, not craftsmen. American shipyards used shortcuts. They welded instead of riveting, which any real shipbuilder knew was inferior. Welds could crack. Welds could fail in storms. The Americans even let women work in their factories, which seemed ridiculous to the Japanese commanders. How could a nation of comfort seekers and factory workers ever match the Imperial Navy's skill and determination? On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes struck Pearl Harbor like thunder from a clear sky. Battleships exploded. Men died in flames and water. America's Pacific Fleet burned. The attack was brilliant, precise, devastating. Admiral Yamamoto's pilots flew perfectly. They dropped their torpedoes exactly as trained. When the smoke cleared, 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. The Japanese losses were tiny, almost nothing. In Tokyo, officers celebrated. They had proven their superiority. America would sue for peace within months, but something was wrong. The American aircraft carriers weren't in port that morning. They escaped. The fuel storage tanks on the shore weren't hit. The repair facilities survived. These seemed like small details at the time. The admirals dismissed these concerns. They had struck a mighty blow. America would surely surrender soon. They were wrong about everything. By early 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, strange reports started arriving at Naval Intelligence Headquarters. Japanese submarine commanders were seeing things that didn't make sense. American cargo ships were appearing in the Pacific in large numbers. New ships. Identical ships. Dozens of them. The submarines sank several, and more appeared. Where were they all coming from? Intelligence officers brought the reports to the admirals. The Americans were building cargo ships in their shipyards, but something was impossible about the numbers. According to captured documents and spy reports, the Americans claimed they could build a large cargo ship in less than 2 months. Some reports said they were doing it in weeks. The admirals looked at these reports and laughed. It was clearly propaganda or American boasting. Everyone knew that building a proper cargo ship took at least a year, often 2. The Americans were lying to boost morale. One admiral pointed at the reports with disgust. These American ships were welded, not riveted. They were built by workers with only weeks of training. Many of the workers were women who had never touched industrial equipment before the war started. The ships were assembled from prefabricated parts like children's toys. This wasn't real shipbuilding. This was factory assembly line nonsense applied to vessels that would sail in the most dangerous ocean on Earth. The admiral predicted these welded ships would break apart in storms. They would crack in cold water. They would be death traps for their crews. Another officer agreed. He had studied American industry. Yes, they had many factories. Yes, they produced cars and refrigerators in vast numbers. But ships weren't cars. Ships required skill, tradition, knowledge that took years to develop. You couldn't just hire someone off the street, give them a welding torch, and expect them to build a seaworthy vessel. The whole idea was absurd. These American shortcuts would be their undoing. Quality would triumph over quantity. As it always did, the admirals filed the reports away and returned to planning their next offensive. They had real warships to deploy, real battles to win. Let the Americans build their welded trash. Let them waste their steel on ships that would sink themselves. The Imperial Japanese Navy would continue doing things the right way, the proven way, the warrior's way. In a few months, they would control the entire Pacific, and America's industrial might wouldn't matter at all. None of them realized they had just made the greatest miscalculation in naval history. By the summer of 1942, the reports kept coming, and they kept getting worse. Japanese submarine commanders were no longer laughing. They were confused, then worried, then quietly terrified. Commander Hashimoto surfaced his submarine at night near the California coast and counted ships through his periscope. He saw 17 cargo vessels in one convoy. 17 identical ships, all the same design, all painted the same gray, all moving together like a school of fish. He had sunk 2 American cargo ships the previous week. Where were all these new ones coming from? He wasn't alone. Every submarine captain in the Pacific was reporting the same thing. They would sink American ships, feel victorious, then see more ships the next week. The Americans weren't just replacing their losses. They were multiplying. Captain Tanaka sank 3 cargo ships in 1 month near Australia. He felt proud, like a samurai who had struck mighty blows. Then intelligence told him that America had launched 70 new cargo ships that same month. 70. His 3 kills meant nothing. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. Intelligence officers in Tokyo started receiving captured American documents from raids on occupied islands. The documents talked about a man named Henry Kaiser who had never built a ship before the war. He owned construction companies that made dams and roads. Now he was running shipyards. 6 of them. The documents described something called prefabrication, where ships were built in pieces at different factories, then assembled at the shipyard like giant puzzles. Workers who had been farming or teaching school 6 months ago were now welding ship hulls. The training program lasted 4 weeks. One intelligence officer brought a thick file to his commander. Inside were photographs taken by spies, stolen blueprints, and worker testimonies from neutral countries. The officer's hands shook slightly as he laid out the evidence. The Americans had 18 major shipyards now, all building the same design called Liberty ships. Each shipyard had multiple building ways where ships were constructed. Some yards had 10 ways running at the same time. The Americans worked 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The yards never slept. Giant cranes lifted prefabricated sections weighing 30 tons. Arc welders worked in teams, their torches blazing like small suns, joining steel plates in minutes that would take Japanese riveters hours. The commander studied the photographs. He saw women in work clothes and protective masks welding steel. He saw old men and young boys working side by side. He saw assembly lines inside factories producing ship parts like they were making bicycles. One photograph showed a launching ceremony where a ship slid into the water while another ship was already under construction on the same way. They were building them that fast. The commander felt something cold settle in his stomach. The numbers were becoming impossible to ignore. Japan's entire merchant marine fleet consisted of about 6 million tons of shipping. Every shipyard in Japan, working at full capacity, could produce maybe 3 to 5 new cargo ships per month. The Americans were claiming they could launch 3 Liberty ships per day at peak production. 3 per day. The math was simple and terrifying. In 1 month, America could build more shipping tonnage than Japan could build in a year. Then came the report that made even the most confident admirals go quiet. In November 1942, the Richmond shipyard in California built a complete Liberty ship in 4 days and 15 hours. The ship was named the Robert E. Peary. Reporters were invited to watch. Photographers documented every step. It wasn't a secret or propaganda. It was real. The Americans built a functional cargo ship, from laying the keel to launching it into the water in less than a week. A Japanese master craftsman would spend 2 years or more building a comparable vessel. The Americans did it in 4 days. The contrast was crushing. In Japanese shipyards, elderly craftsmen with 50 years of experience carefully placed each rivet by hand. They heated the rivets until they glowed orange, then hammered them into place with rhythmic precision passed down through generations. It was beautiful work, honorable work. A single riveter might place 200 rivets in a day if he was skilled and fast. In American yards, a welder could join steel plates in minutes. The welds were inspected quickly and the work moved forward. Speed over perfection. Volume over art. Japanese workers took pride in their labor. They knew every ship by name. They blessed each vessel before it launched. They worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, driven by duty and national pride. American workers worked 3 shifts around the clock, yes, but they also got overtime pay and hot meals in factory cafeterias. They had safety regulations and unions. Many were women who had never worked outside their homes before. They were called Rosie the Riveter and Wendy the Welder. They wore pants and work boots. They packed their lunches and earned paychecks and went home to their families. They weren't warriors. They were just workers doing jobs. And somehow, impossibly, they were winning. By late 1942, Japanese submarines had sunk over 200 American merchant ships. It was an impressive number. Any other nation would have been crippled by such losses. But American shipyards had built over 700 new ships in that same time. Japan was sinking them faster than any navy in history and still losing the math. Still falling behind. Still watching the gap grow wider. One admiral finally said out loud what others were thinking. He was looking at a map showing American convoy routes, each line representing dozens of ships moving across the Pacific. He put down his pointer and turned to his fellow officers. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "We are not fighting a nation," he said. "We are fighting a factory. A factory that never stops, never sleeps, never runs out of workers or steel or the will to keep building. How do you sink a factory? No one had an answer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the spring of 1943, a meeting took place in an underground bunker beneath Tokyo. The room was lit by electric lights that flickered sometimes when bombs fell in the distance. Steam pipes hissed in the corners. The air smelled like concrete dust and cigarette smoke. Around a large table sat the senior members of the naval staff, the men who planned Japan's strategy. Before them lay stacks of papers covered in numbers. The numbers told a story no one wanted to believe. A young officer with dark circles under his eyes stood to present his calculations. He had spent 3 months gathering data, checking it twice, then checking it again because he hoped he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. He clicked on a projector and numbers appeared on the wall. In 1942, Japan had started the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. They had lost 2 million tons to submarines, air attacks, and accidents. They had built 400,000 tons of new shipping. The math was simple. They were losing ships 5 times faster than they could replace them. At this rate, Japan would have no merchant fleet by 1945. An admiral interrupted. What about the Americans? Surely they were suffering similar losses. The young officer changed the slide. American losses were heavy, yes. They had lost over 1 million tons of shipping. But they had built 8 million tons of new shipping in 1942 alone. They were building ships 15 times faster than they were losing them. The gap wasn't closing. It was growing. It was becoming a canyon that no amount of Japanese courage or skill could cross. The room went quiet. Someone coughed. Papers rustled. No one wanted to speak the truth out loud, but everyone understood it. Japan could not win a war of numbers. They had believed quality would triumph over quantity, that warrior spirit would overcome industrial might, that 10 perfect swords could defeat 1,000 average ones. They were wrong. In total war, arithmetic mattered more than honor. Production mattered more than tradition. The Americans weren't better warriors. They were better at making things, lots of things, all the time. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. Before his death in April 1943, he had tried to warn them. He had studied in America, walked their streets, seen their factories. He knew what they were capable of when motivated. After Pearl Harbor, he never celebrated. He told colleagues privately that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. He gave Japan 6 months to win the war before American production overwhelmed them. He was right. Now he was dead, shot down over the Solomon Islands, and his warning echoed in the minds of officers who wished they had listened. The ideological collapse happened slowly, then all at once. For generations, Japanese military doctrine had been built on the idea of Bushido, the warrior's way. It taught that spirit conquered matter, that discipline defeated disorder, that 1 trained samurai was worth 10 peasants. This worked in older wars, smaller wars, wars fought with swords and rifles. But this was a different kind of war. This was an industrial war, where factories mattered as much as battlefields, where housewives with welding torches became weapons as deadly as any soldier. The Liberty. Ships weren't breaking apart like the admirals predicted. Reports came in from submarine commanders who had torpedoed them. The ships were tough. 1 Liberty ship took 2 torpedo hits and still made it to port. Another survived a kamikaze attack that should have sunk her. They sailed through Pacific storms that would have tested even the finest Japanese vessels. The welds held. The hulls stayed strong. The ships the admirals had called floating coffins and welded trash were proving seaworthy and reliable. American engineering, which the Japanese had dismissed as crude shortcuts, actually worked. More disturbing was learning what each Liberty ship could carry. 1 Liberty ship had a cargo capacity of 10,000 tons. It could transport enough steel, food, fuel, and ammunition to supply a small army for months. Japan's entire shipbuilding industry could produce maybe one ship of similar size per month if they worked hard and nothing went wrong. America could load one Liberty ship with more cargo than Japan could build capacity for in 30 days. The Americans were fighting with abundance. Japan was fighting with scarcity. There was no honor in scarcity, no victory in running out. Japanese military planners began to understand they had misread everything about American society. They thought democracy made America weak, but democracy meant millions of citizens volunteered to help the war effort. They thought capitalism made Americans selfish, but capitalism meant factories could retool quickly and compete to produce the most ships. They thought American softness meant laziness, but it really meant efficiency, finding easier ways to do hard work. They thought letting women work in factories was shameful, but those women were building the ships that carried the armies that were winning the war. Senior officers spoke the truth that haunted them all. His voice was steady, but his eyes looked tired, much older than his years. He said they had trained for 100 years to perfect the sword. They had created the finest naval warriors in history. Their pilots flew with skill no American could match. Their sailors had discipline no Western Navy could equal. They had perfected the art of war. But the Americans hadn't tried to perfect the sword. They had built 10,000 swords in 100 days. They had turned war into manufacturing. They had made victory a matter of production schedules and factory shifts. The officer continued. Japan had 5,000 years of warrior tradition. America had 200 years of factory tradition. In this war, factories beat warriors. Women with 4 weeks of training beat master craftsmen with 50 years of experience. Not because the women were better at the craft, but because there were so many of them, working so fast, building so much. Numbers crushed excellence. Volume drowned quality. The Americans had turned warfare into something Japan didn't know how to fight. An economic competition disguised as a military conflict. By mid-1944, the calculations showed Japan had already lost. Not militarily, not yet, but mathematically. The war would continue for another year, and hundreds of thousands more would die. But the outcome was decided in the shipyards of California and the steel mills of Pennsylvania and the welding schools where housewives became industrial workers. Japan had won battles and lost the war in the same moment. They had destroyed ships and been buried by production. They had fought with honor and been defeated by arithmetic. The admirals who once laughed at American welders now knew the terrible truth. They hadn't lost to better warriors. They had lost to a better system. In August 1945, the war ended not with glory, but with atomic fire and unconditional surrender. Japanese naval officers who had spent 4 years fighting across the Pacific returned home to a country they barely recognized. The trains that carried them from the ports were crowded and slow. Windows were broken. Paint was peeling. Everything looked tired and old and used up. Men in tattered uniforms sat in silence, staring at landscapes scarred by bombing. Rice paddies lay empty. Factories stood as burned skeletons of twisted metal. The rising sun still hung in the sky, but it seemed dimmer somehow, less proud. When the officers reached the naval shipyards where their careers had begun, they found ruins. The great building ways where master craftsmen had spent years creating beautiful warships were now rubble and ash. The tools that had been passed down through generations were melted or stolen or broken. The cranes that had lifted armor plates stood frozen in twisted positions, damaged beyond repair. Grass was already growing through cracks in the concrete. The smell of rust and salt water mixed with the smell of defeat. An admiral who had dismissed American welders 4 years earlier walked through the Yokosuka Naval Yard, where he had watched the Yamato being built. That magnificent battleship, The pride of Japan, the largest warship ever made, was now at the bottom of the ocean. So was nearly every other ship Japan had built. The Admiral's shoes crunched on broken glass and debris. He remembered standing in this exact spot in 1941, watching workers place rivets with perfect precision, believing that such quality could never be beaten. He had been so certain. He had been so wrong. The final numbers were brutal and exact. Japan had started the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. At the end, less than 200,000 tons remained afloat. Most of those ships were damaged or barely seaworthy. The empire's entire ability to move supplies, to feed its people, to transport anything anywhere was nearly destroyed. 4 years of submarine warfare, air attacks, and mines had done what the admirals once thought impossible. They had erased Japan's merchant fleet from the ocean. America's numbers told the opposite story. They had built 2,710 Liberty ships, not including all the other types of cargo ships, tankers, and military vessels. Just the Liberty ships alone added up to 18 million tons of new shipping. 18 million tons. Japan's entire pre-war merchant fleet could have fit inside America's wartime construction 3 times over, with room left for more. The Americans had built more ships in 4 years than Japan had built in 4 decades. The officers carried these numbers home like stones in their pockets, heavy and inescapable. They had studied American naval tactics before the war, learned about their battleships and carriers and destroyers. But they had ignored American industrial capacity. They had dismissed factory workers and welders and assembly lines as unworthy of serious military consideration. That ignorance had cost Japan everything. Wars were no longer won just on battlefields by warriors with swords. Wars were won in factories by workers with tools. The officers had prepared to fight the last war, the war of Bushido and honor. America had fought the next war, the war of production and logistics. Some officers brought home more than just defeat. They brought home understanding. They had seen what happened when a whole nation mobilized for war, when every citizen became part of the effort, when factories ran day and night without stopping. Japan had asked its warriors to be perfect. America had asked its workers to be productive. Japan had created masterpieces. America had created volume. In the arithmetic of total war, Volume 1, always, predictably, mathematically. This understanding changed how Japan rebuilt. The officers who survived became leaders in the new Japan, the peaceful Japan, the Japan that would never fight another war. They took the lessons learned in defeat and applied them to peacetime. If American methods could outproduce Japanese methods in war, maybe those same methods could outproduce Japanese methods in peace. The prefabrication techniques that built Liberty ships became models for Japanese manufacturing. The quality control that made those welded ships seaworthy became the foundation of Japanese industrial standards. The efficiency that let housewives become welders in weeks became the basis for Japanese worker training programs. In the decades after the war, Japan became an industrial giant. Companies like Toyota studied American production methods and improved them. Sony took American technology and refined it. Japan became known worldwide for efficiency, quality, and manufacturing excellence. The irony was complete. The nation that had scorned American industrial methods adopted them, perfected them, and used them to rebuild a prosperity greater than they had ever known in war. The admirals who once laughed at welders lived to see their grandchildren become engineers in factories that supplied the world. One of those admirals, now old and retired, gave an interview in the 1970s. His voice was soft and his hands shook slightly as he held his tea. The interviewer asked what lesson he had learned from the war. The admiral was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at Tokyo's modern skyline, at the factories and office buildings and busy streets. Then he spoke. "We feared their battleships," he said. "We should have feared their welders." We counted their admirals. We should have counted their shipyards. We prepared to defeat their navy. We should have prepared to outlast their economy. The war was lost not at Midway or Guadalcanal, but in every American factory running 3 shifts, in every woman who picked up a welding torch, in every Liberty ship that slid into the water while we were still laying keels. They did not outfight us. They outbuilt us. And in total war, that was everything. He paused, sipped his tea, and added one more thought. We believed the sword was mightier than the factory. We learned that in modern war, the factory makes the swords, and the side with more factories wins. That is the truth we brought home from defeat. That is the lesson that rebuilt Japan. Never again would we mistake tradition for strength or confuse honor with victory. War is mathematics. We forgot that. America remembered it. The numbers never lie. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.